The United States has reportedly launched 2 airstrikes against Iranian-backed forces in Syria. According to the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM forces responded to attempted coordinated rocket attacks and killed 2 or 3 suspected Iran-backed militants during a U.S. helicopter attack. Just this week, the State Department announced it had submitted a formal reply to Iran over restoration of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And while some are lauding Biden over this revival, Israeli officials are warning the U.S. against negotiations. One of the biggest concerns for Israel, according to Axios, is that the U.S. would press the International Atomic Energy Agency to close its investigations into Iran's undeclared nuclear activity. Professor at Georgetown University and author of Losing an Enemy, Trita Parsi is here to weigh in. Trita, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with that question of Israel's claims about the investigations. What likelihood do you assign to the possibility of what they're saying, that these investigations go away if the deal is restored?
0. These investigations will go away once the Iranians have responded to the questions that the IAEA has. Most of the problem lies in what Iran did more than 20 years ago. And as a result, naturally, if there's a way to prevent the Iranians from having a nuclear bomb, that's going to be more important than allowing something that happened 20 years ago to kick up a new crisis. Having said that, it's not going to be put to rest unless the Iranians give satisfactory answers to the IAEA, as they did back in 2015 when a similar issue arose, and they had to answer those questions before the IAEA was satisfied, and they did. And this time around, there's new information because the Israelis managed to get into one of the warehouses where the Iranians were keeping some of those secrets. All that did, though, is that it confirmed what we already knew, but added a bit more detail. There's nothing in what has been released by the Israelis that is actually changing the picture in any way, shape, or form, except for adding a bit more detail.
And so because these negotiations around this deal involve basically all of the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies, and because you have a kind of, and you could describe it better, but an Iranian regime whose intelligence operations are kind of disaggregated into a lot of different actors around the world who have some autonomy, but are also guided by a general idea of which direction they're heading. That leads to an intense amount of speculation around the world about how we can read the tea leaves of different events. And without sounding too crazy, I wanted to ask you about a bunch of the different reports that we've been seeing around the world of Iranian dissidents either coming under attack or actually being attacked. I mean, Salman Rushdie, obviously the biggest example here in the United States, but you've had a number of others in Europe and elsewhere around the world, who have been victims of, or there have been foiled attempts to come after them. And you have two camps. One camp saying this is obviously done by Iran. These are Iranian dissidents. Then you have another camp that says no, actually these are Israeli operations that are being done because we're getting so close to a deal being struck between all of these entities that are trying to blow it up, which it sounds crazy. Israel's intelligence apparatus has done this type of thing before. That's not controversial. The question is it happening now? What's your read on these different incidents going on around the world?
There's a third possibility to what you said, which is that it may be something completely different. There's a history of the Iranian regime targeting dissidents abroad, in Europe, in the United States as well. So, that is a precedent. It has existed, and in many different cases that have been taking place in the last couple of years, there's definitely a strong plausibility that the Iranians are behind it. The idea that the Israelis would be behind it, I'm a bit more skeptical towards the Israelis have done a lot of assassinations inside of Iran. And if they want to do something to scuttle the talks, it's actually more effective for them, they think, to target the Iranian program, create mayhem, suspicion inside of Iran, getting parts of the regime to think that other parts of the regime may be working with the Israelis, et cetera, than to target some dissident in the United States or in Europe. But there's also the third possibility that in some of these cases, it may not have been any of these different. There's been plenty of accusations that have been thrown around in previous cases and turn out that it was none of these two different actors.
Right. Well, State Department spokesperson Ned Price had this to say about the deal. Let's take a listen to that.
Well, again, it's quite simple. We wouldn't trust Iran. This is a deal that is predicated on the most rigorous, the most restrictive and intensive verification and monitoring regime ever negotiated. This would be about IAEA inspectors on the ground, able to look at sites that were of interest. This would be about monitoring, cameras, other technology that would see to it that Iran was living up to its side of the deal. If we were to get back into this deal and if Iran were to attempt to violate it, we would know that and we would be able to respond accordingly.
So negotiations over both the first JCPOA and this have happened in interesting contexts regarding our relationship with Russia. And I'm curious, Trita, because there Ned Price said, this isn't about trusting the Iranians. We're also using essentially Russia as an intermediary in this case. And the relationship between the United States and Russia right now, as it was back in 2015, is in an interesting place. What do we know about how that relationship could affect, everything that hasn't, some experts, I've heard them say something that makes a lot of sense to me. Everything that remains on the table, that remains to actually be hammered out as a deal, is there for a reason, because it's really freaking hard to finish these last questions. These final questions remain for a reason. What do we know about how our relationship with Russia right now, amid the ground war in Ukraine, could affect these very fragile negotiations in the coming days?
So I wouldn't characterize it as the United States using Russia as a mediator. You're absolutely correct that in the previous round of negotiations, the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans all were on board, and it was very critical to have a united front between these countries versus Iran in the negotiations. And frankly, the Russians back then were very, very useful. This time around, it's different because, as you pointed out correctly, U.S.-Russia relations are in a very different place now compared to 2015. What has happened since the invasion of Ukraine is that the European mediators, they're the ones that actually are mediating, they have essentially gone back and forth between the United States and Iran and not involved the Russians until some form of an agreement has first been hammered out by the Iranians and the Americans in order to avoid the possibility or the risk that the Russians would do something to stop it. Moreover, in previous rounds, the Russians played an important role in the sense that some of Iran's low-enriched uranium needed to be shipped out to Russia. Those things are not part of this agreement this time around, as I understand.
And what's your read on how close we are? Do you expect an announcement soon? Are we like, if you heard this afternoon that a deal had been struck, would that be shocking to you? Or are we that close?
We are closer than we ever have been since this strategy of negotiation started. I personally believe that the Biden administration should have just gone back in through an executive order on day one or on week one, as he did with Paris Agreement, as he did with WHO. But they chose this negotiated path. And in that path, this is the closest we have been. And the ball is back in Iran's court because the United States responded about 2 days ago. And the Iranians may take a couple of more days, but I would be surprised if this were to take more than another 2 weeks, because at that point, the likelihood of the deal actually being able to be finished because of the American political calendar actually goes down. And hopefully the Iranians are well aware of that.
That's a great point. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.